Chapter 83. Grandfather. Is our Lee family truly not a family of traitors? Jeong. Is that question related to the scars on your face? 11-year-old Lee Jeong gave no answer to his grandfather's question. These things were inevitable while attending the sect's martial arts academy. Traitors, a family of betrayal. He endured all kinds of disregard and harassment. He tried to ignore it and fought back against their bullying. However, it was meaningless. It was a shackle that had come down from his grandfather, who had pledged loyalty to the disappeared lunar vein, and it was the price. Is it not a shackle that our Lee family can never escape from? Jeong. His grandfather looked at Lee Jeong, full of scars, with pity. Then, embracing him warmly, he comforted him with a gentle yet firm voice. Do you remember what this old man told you? Lying on firewood and tasting gall. Lying on firewood and tasting gall. It means to endure hardships for the future by sleeping on thorny brushwood and chewing on bile. His grandfather would habitually say those words to him. That was because his grandfather's honor, who had been one of the 10 founders of the sect and walked in high places, had fallen to the bottom after that day. Why aren't you answering? I don't know anymore. He had tried to endure as his grandfather had said. However, it was futile to try to mend his increasingly shattered heart. Why did his grandfather, his father, and he himself have to suffer like this? Even though it was not a sin they had committed, just because they had pledged loyalty, did they have to be rejected by the sect to this extent? Grandfather, why don't you just pledge eternal loyalty to the society leader? That day, for the first time, he saw a terrifying look on his grandfather's face. His grandfather, who had never expressed it, was enraged to this degree at the mention of pledging loyalty to the society leader and escaping the stigma of a shackle. Why was he angry at him? Had he said something wrong? For the first time, a sense of rebellion arose in his surging heart. Did I say something wrong? Why must we, a meritorious family and one of the sect's founding members, Lee Jeong could not continue speaking due to the ear-splitting pain. To him, suffering in pain, his grandfather spoke with bloodshot eyes. Regardless of the outcome, it is natural for a retainer to trust their lord until the end. Did this old man teach you otherwise? That so-called lord has gone astray, and our family has even been branded as traitors. But what meaning does that have? And didn't you also accept that fault, which is why you accepted being demoted to a valley master and imprisoned in the corpse blood valley for 4 generations? The more he thought about it, the more infuriating it was. Why didn't his grandfather strongly assert that he had no connection to that person? Why were they sharing in that person's sins? Because he was a retainer? I can't accept it. After that day, Lee Jeong no longer conversed with his grandfather, and he gritted his teeth and immersed himself in martial arts training. He couldn't endure it without immersing himself in something. As a result of his immersion in training, he became the first in his family to successfully reach the 5th stage of the Crimson Flame Sword Art's advanced technique, the blazing cultivation, before coming of age. Lee Jeong became even more motivated by this opportunity. I can do it. Among his family's ancestors, no one had completed the Crimson Flame Sword Art. Even his grandfather's limit was the 8th stage. This was because the more one cultivated the blazing cultivation, the stronger the fiery yang qi became, and it didn't just end with it becoming stronger but also burned the practitioner's own body. However, he was confident that he could surpass the 8th stage and reach the 9th and even the 10th stage realm. And perhaps this excessive desire became poison? Do not attempt the 6th stage until the 5th stage is perfectly ingrained in your body. Ignoring his father's warning, Lee Jeong's body burst into flames as he recklessly attempted the 6th stage. Upon reaching the 6th stage of the blazing cultivation, one could imbue the Crimson Flame Sword Art with fiery yang qi, but he had failed and suffered a backlash. In an instant, the flames engulfed his arm and half of his face, and he couldn't come to his senses. The rampaging fiery yang qi had already surpassed the level he could control. Was he going to die like this after being too greedy? At that moment, someone grabbed him as he was rampaging. and they absorbed the rampaging fiery yang qi and stabilized it. The one who absorbed the fiery yang qi from his burning body was none other than his grandfather, Li Wamun. Barely regaining consciousness amidst the pain, Li Jeong couldn't hide his shock. Like his grandfather and father, if one forcibly accepted the fiery yang qi without being able to perfectly control it, sizzle, the fire would turn against oneself. Thanks to taking away the fiery yang qi, Li Jeong's body could be stabilized. But his grandfather Li Wamun was not the same. In an instant, his entire body was engulfed in flames. It was on a level incomparable to Li Jeong's. Ah no, no, grandfather, grandfather. Li Jeong rushed forward, trying to calm Li Wamun's fiery yang qi. However, grandfather Li Wamun used his profound true energy to prevent him from entering his vicinity, making it impossible to approach. Grandfather. No, Grandpa. It had been nearly 4 years since they had been this close, and it had to be like this. Thanks to his profound internal energy, his body was slowly burning, but his grandfather's flesh had already turned red and oozing. Grandpa, please, please. Li Jeong tried to forcibly break through his true energy. Grandfather Li Wamun slowly shook his head at him with a bitter face. He could tell from the shape of his lips. Don't come, my grandson. That sight tore Li Jeong's heart apart. Watching his grandfather's body slowly burn right in front of him, his feelings were utter despair. He waited for his grandfather's true energy to weaken and tried to somehow subdue the fiery yang qi. But this was too painful. Please, please. He begged his grandfather to withdraw his true energy. However, his grandfather did not withdraw his true energy until his flesh was completely burned away. Only when his breath ceased did the barrier formed by his true energy disappear. Ah! Li Jeong screamed. His despair at witnessing his grandfather dying from start to finish because of him was tragic. If possible, he wanted to exchange his life with his grandfather's. However, that was impossible. Ugh! After wailing and crying for more than half a day, Li Jeong could only stop when he fainted from exhaustion. After waking up like that, everything proceeded quickly and in a complicated manner. It was because he had to hold a funeral for his deceased grandfather. He confessed to everyone in the family, including his father, that his grandfather had died because of him. However, no one blamed him. Even if you were hasty, it's not your fault. It's the fault of all of us for not teaching you properly and giving weak warnings. Please, please punish me. His father, who had become the head of the family, shook his head and firmly refused. It was because his grandfather Li Wamun would not have wanted that. But if your grandfather had resented you even a little until his last breath, then do so. He hadn't. Even while enduring the immense pain of his body burning, his grandfather never showed it. He just kept his mouth shut with the most indifferent face possible, as if worrying about him would hurt his heart. All of that was consideration for him. Throughout the funeral, Li Jeong silently shed tears. After holding his grandfather's funeral amidst sorrow, Li Jeong came across a line of poetry left behind by his grandfather. It was like the deceased's last will. Ah, the day I looked at the black robe and followed behind always lingers. No matter how much time passes, how could I ever forget that time in my dreams? He thought he had no more tears left to shed. Yet seeing this, painful tears flowed out as if being squeezed. Even though he was one of the 10 founders, most of the executives, including the society leader, did not attend the funeral due to the stigma of disgrace, yet he insisted on loyalty until the end. Did that mean he believed in that person that much? His heart grew complicated. Li Jeong found that person so hateful. However, after seeing his grandfather's last words expressing longing for his former lord, he felt conflicted. That person whom his grandfather had believed in until the end, the bastard who inherited the Li family's orthodox lineage, had insulted his grandfather's loyalty and will. Grandfather! At that moment, Li Jeong made a decision. His grandfather's will, which he had upheld nobly until death while enduring everything with patience. He would inherit that will. This unworthy grandson will carry on that loyalty. Even if it was a terrible stigma, even if it was a time of suffering, he decided to carry on that will in order to restore his deceased grandfather's honor. It can't be. The master of the Corpse Blood Valley, Jeong, couldn't hide his shock at the sight unfolding before his eyes. At first, he thought Mok Jae-un was using some bizarre sorcery. However, seeing that being taking form amidst the blood, he was at a loss for words. A peerless beauty with blood-red eyes, wearing a crown and holding a long pipe, that face where arrogance and majesty coexisted. The moment he saw this, the image of that person his deceased grandfather Lee Wamun had spoken of with a ringing in his ears naturally overlapped. Don't hate that person too much. The master that this old man devoted half his life to serving was not the despicable traitor you think. That person was stronger and more beautiful than anyone else in the sect. He had just lightly brushed off his grandfather's words. It was because he didn't think it outweighed the wounds he had received while growing up. However, the moment he saw her, he understood his grandfather's words. They say those who rule are born to do so. Ah! The being before his eyes seemed literally born to rule. Just by looking down as if to subdue, he felt a shudder and even reverence at her overwhelming presence. Then, Mok Jae-un's voice reached his ears. How do you feel after directly seeing that person? That person? Lee Jeong's heart pounded and raced. Was this being before his eyes truly that person his grandfather had longed for until the end? At that moment, Lee Jeong knelt on one knee as if his legs had given out. Thud! It didn't matter whether the being before his eyes was a ghost or whatever. He had vowed before his grandfather's spirit tablet to inherit the noble loyalty he had upheld until death. Lee Jeong bowed his head, clasped his hands together, and paid his respects. Lee Jeong, head of the Lee family, pays his respects to the Lord, the master of the lunar vein. At Lee Jeong's utmost greeting, a glint of interest flashed in Mok Jae-un's eyes. On the other hand, Chong Ryong glanced at Mok Jae-un with a triumphant gaze. Did you see that, mortal? She had boasted to Mok Jae-un. Even if the other rotten ones were unknown, if it was the blood descendant of Lee Wamun, whom she knew, he would still uphold that loyalty. At her words, Mok Jae-un had inwardly sneered. A whole century had passed. Yet it was ridiculous to think that the will of loyalty would remain. You've become a vengeful spirit, yet you believe in humans? He found it truly foolish. Even in just a few years, everything fades. So, thinking that loyalty would continue when the person in question had died and disappeared, wasn't that just a vain hope? However, something truly unexpected happened. It turned out differently from my intention. Mok Jae-un smacked his lips. He had wanted to see her reaction, unable to hide her disappointment as her vain hopes were shattered. Yet he had ended up making her elated instead. How unfortunate. Well, it wasn't entirely bad. The fact that the loyalty had been passed down even after 100 years meant it was worth using. Just as Chong Ryong was about to open her mouth, right at that moment, clap, 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 Mok Jae-un formed a hand seal with one hand and extended the wooden doll towards Chong Ryong. Forbidden seal, formless figure. Two names become one. Quickly obey and seal. As soon as the incantation ended, her spirit body, which had barely emerged, was instantly sucked into the wooden doll. With that, the blood-stained ghost realm formed by Chong Ryong disappeared, and the office instantly returned to its original state. Shudder. Noticing this change, Lee Jeong frowned and raised his head. Where had that person who was there just a moment ago disappeared to? Of course, Chong Ryong was inside the wooden doll. Squirm. The wooden doll wriggled, and Chong Ryong's voice echoed in Mok Jae-un's ear. You damn mortal bastard. What the hell are you doing? She had barely revealed her spirit body and confirmed his loyalty. Then, she should have drawn this fellow in and given him orders. But why was he suddenly sealing her back into the wooden doll? Meanwhile, Mok Jae-un spoke. Did you see? That person has become a vengeful spirit with lingering resentment and is with me. You bastard! Lee Jeong stood up and looked at Mok Jae-eun. That person's appearance just now was definitely not an illusion or anything like that. Lee Jeong asked Mok Jae-eun, "Where is that person?" "I just told you. That person is with me." "Then let me see that person again. I have so many things I want to ask." At Lee Jeong's request, Mok Jae-eun pointed at himself with his thumb. "Isn't that person right in front of your eyes?" "What?" At Lee Jeong's retort, asking what he was talking about, Mok Jae-eun smiled brightly and said, "I am that person's vessel of possession. It may be difficult for you to understand, but when that person possesses me, that person and I become one." "Ha!" At Mok Jae-eun's words, Jeong Ryong inside the wooden doll was dumbfounded. He had barely shown her form, so why did he seal her back inside this? Mok Jae-eun's purpose was clear. That loyalty spanning generations. I'll take it for myself. Chapter 84. Jeong Ryong, who had noticed Mok Jae-eun's intention, clicked her tongue inwardly. What kind of guy was he? The Lee family had maintained their loyalty to her for over 100 years, spanning generations. Yet watching Mok Jae-eun snatching away that loyalty in this manner made her anger surge. She felt like breaking the ceiling wooden doll right away, popping out, and beating the hell out of that mortal fellow's head with her long pipe. However, that anger did not last long. "What are you trying to do, mortal?" Rather, she became curious about Mok Jae-eun's intention. He could have borrowed the power of the Lee family through her, so why did he need to snatch it away like this midway? At that moment, Mok Jae-eun spoke. "You know that I am that person and that person is me, so why are you just standing there?" "That's..." At those words, the master of the Corpse Blood Valley, Lee Jeong, suddenly hesitated. He knew well what the word possession meant. It literally meant being possessed by a ghost, didn't it? Vessel of possession for that person? Then should he consider this fellow Mok Jae-eun as the master of the lunar vein? Since he did not have much faith in the strange arts, even though the Heaven and Earth Society had consulting esoteric masters, he felt somewhat hesitant. It also gave him a strangely uncomfortable feeling. Then Mok Jae-eun said, "You directly saw the spirit body, yet you still can't believe it? The atmosphere and everything is completely different. So would you believe it if he suddenly lied about being possessed?" Jeong Ryong clicked her tongue and interjected. At this, Mok Jae-eun smiled brightly and said, "I was confident that you would inherit loyalty spanning generations, and that's why I even revealed this secret, but it's disappointing. And no, that's... Then if I keep the promise from back then, will you believe me? When you say back then? The Crimson Flame sword art. Could it be?" Lee Jeong's eyes trembled. That was because he recalled the words he had heard when learning the Crimson Flame sword art from his grandfather. The blazing cultivation was originally devised by that person and this old man together. We had tried to create the most suitable advanced cultivation technique for the Crimson Flame sword art. However, before we could complete it, that tragedy occurred. Just like him, Mok Jae-eun also recalled what Jeong Ryong had said. "Once, I made a promise with the head of the Lee family, that fellow's grandfather Lee Wamun, to complete the unfinished blazing cultivation together. However, that promise could not be fulfilled while alive. It was fulfilled after death. As she became a higher-grade vengeful spirit over a long time, she regained her reason and gradually realized the parts she had not understood while alive. One of those was the blazing cultivation of the Crimson Flame sword art." Mok Jae-eun extended his hand to Lee Jeong with a smile and said, "Although I have returned as a vengeful spirit with deep resentment, if the Lee family follows me once again, I will teach you the completed circulation technique of the blazing cultivation that I realized only after death." "Damn you, mortal!" At Mok Jae-eun's words, Jeong Ryong's frustration surged. She had just informed him of what was wrong with the technique and what needed to be changed. An ordinary person would forget after hearing it once, but this bastard has memorized it, hasn't he? Mok Jae-eun's memory surpassed common sense. She had gotten angry and wanted to see how he would persuade without her help. But it seemed he was truly going to snatch away the loyalty. Completed circulation technique. At Mok Jaeungun's words, Lee Ji-yeom's eyes trembled even more. 3 generations, from his grandfather to himself, had tried to complete the technique but failed. In fact, it was difficult to complete from the beginning. One had to bear the huge risk of directly verifying it by sending the fiery yang qi to the acupuncture points, which could cost one's life if done incorrectly. If it had been with that person, we might have completed it. Grandfather. But you should be able to do it. Recalling his grandfather again, Lee Ji-yeom's heart ached. At this, he looked at Mok Jaeungun's face, pounded his tingling chest, and knelt on one knee. I'm not kneeling because of the completed circulation technique. Then why? It's because you didn't forget the promise you made with my grandfather. No, our family. And that's why I'm pledging my loyalty once again like this. Promise. You have returned even as a vengeful spirit to resolve the long-cherished wish of my grandfather and our Lee family. So how could I dare to doubt you? Thud. Then Lee Ji-yeom completely prostrated on the ground. Lee Ji-yeom, head of the Lee family and master of the Corpse Blood Valley, once again pledges his loyalty to the master of the lunar vein. Please accept my bow. With that, he touched his forehead to the ground 3 times, expressing his respect and loyalty. Looking down at this, Mok Jaeungun raised the corner of his mouth as if satisfied. Then Jeong Ryong's voice rang in his ear. You crazy mortal bastard. What are you doing, snatching away others' loyalty? The loyalty would have naturally passed on to you if you had just stayed still. Since you've become the direct previous disciple, and I won't be dragging you around forever even after death. Are you feeling refreshed after forcibly taking it? She seemed quite angry. This was the first time he had seen Jeong Ryong talk so much. Well, it made sense for her to be angry after he had snatched away the loyalty of a faithful retainer who had waited for her for 100 years, separate from her grudge. She probably thought he was trash. However, I understand your feelings, but my goal is not to be swayed by your hand. Mok Jaeungun had only one reason for coming here. It was to find the ghost sword, who might be related to taking revenge on the one who killed his grandfather. However, if Jeong Ryong took the lead, moved her former subordinates, and wielded that power, things would only flow in the direction she wanted. Mok Jaeungun did not want the situation to be created that way. It's only secondary to me. Resolving Jeong Ryong's grudge was definitely not a priority for him. She was also a vengeful spirit who would have tried to devour him if not for their predestined bond. Although they had now established a master-disciple relationship due to their absolute bond of fate, Mok Jaeungun fundamentally never trusted anyone. Therefore, he had no intention of giving Jeong Ryong the initiative. Is this the circulation technique completed by you, my liege? The master of the Corpse Blood Valley, Lee Ji-yeom, received the circulation technique written by Mok Jaeungun with trembling hands. It had been the aspiration of the family to complete the technique for 3 generations, so he could not hide his excitement. Exclamations flowed from Lee Ji-yeom's mouth as he read through the technique. Ah! How could they have approached the qi circulation method in this way? Lee Ji-yeom spoke in amazement. It's truly remarkable. I never thought of directly circulating the fiery yang qi from the diaphragm to the yang acupoints. But if this works, it seems we can control the energy to enter the 9th stage. To devise this so easily. Easily devised, my ass. I only realized it after death when my ghost eyes opened. Jeong Ryong grumbled in an angry voice, still not appeased. An advanced cultivation technique like the blazing cultivation that could directly handle fiery yang qi had a high risk in the first place, so it could only be completed after countless trials, errors, and sacrifices. In a way, from Lee Ji-yeom's perspective, it could be said that he had encountered a fateful opportunity. As he continued reading the technique, Lee Ji-yeom frowned. Then he carefully said to Mok Jaeungun, "But my liege, it seems you haven't written the entire technique." "That's right. Pardon. I only wrote half of it." At those words, Lee Ji-yeom was about to ask why but soon closed his mouth. Looking at Mok Jaeungun's smiling face, he could guess what his intention was. "Did you do it on purpose?" "That's right." "Why did you?" "Even though I completed the technique, we should be careful. I did it because I was worried that you might be too hasty and get burned again. Ah! At Mok Jeongun's words, Lee Jeong let out a small gasp. Was it because he was concerned that he might bring about a situation where he would be consumed by the fiery yang qi if he recklessly tried to master the completed technique? He seemed to have misunderstood. He had thought that it might be because Mok Jeongun couldn't fully trust him yet. Chong Ryong snorted. Even after receiving a pledge of loyalty, you sure have a hard time trusting. She knew Mok Jeongun well. She was certain that the reason he didn't teach the entire technique was definitely not out of concern for Lee Jeong. Yes, correct. Of course, that was accurate. Mok Jeongun did not completely trust Lee Jeong even though he had pledged loyalty. That's why he had only provided the appropriate bait. Trust him moderately. I guarantee you Lee members' loyalty towards me. At her words, Mok Jeongun showed a faint smile. Her trust in her former loyal subordinate was her freedom. But he was different. He intended to maintain some level of vigilance until he was certain. At that moment, Lee Jeong put the paper with the technique written on it into his bosom and spoke. But my liege, if it's not disrespectful, may I ask what happened that day at the Horyang battle 100 years ago? Horyang battle? What was that? At his question, Mok Jeongun's eyes narrowed. He didn't expect the master of the Corpse Blood Valley, Lee Jeong, to suddenly ask about Chong Ryong's past that he didn't know about. At this, Chong Ryong spoke in a sneering voice. Do your best. I won't help or interfere with anything related to the Lee family, especially with you, mortal. She had no intention of telling him the information since he had snatched away the Lee family's loyalty. It meant for him to bear the hardship properly. Horyang battle. It was a memory she could never forget. That memory had become the root of her becoming a vengeful spirit. In the first place, she had no intention of telling this mortal fellow right away, so she thought it was perfect. Just then, Mok Jeongun spoke nonchalantly. You want to know about that? At this, Chong Ryong was dumbfounded. Was he asking what he wanted to know without knowing anything? Then Lee Jeong replied. Yes, my grandfather believed in her liege until the end, but due to the incident that day, he was demoted from a king to a valley master, and our main family was expelled from the castle and has been imprisoned here in the Corpse Blood Valley for 3 generations. Ah! At Lee Jeong's words, Chong Ryong felt bitter. The Lee family was a founding family of the Heaven and Earth Society, yet they were humiliated like this. Just how far were they willing to insult her and ruin the Heaven and Earth Society? Indeed, she could never forgive him. At that moment, Mok Jeongun said, How does the Valley Master know about what happened that day at the Horyang battle? I'm curious about how you and the sect know about it. What? At Mok Jeongun's question, Chong Ryong inwardly clicked her tongue. This fellow always found a way out somehow. On the contrary, she did not expect him to throw a question back like this. No, was it because he could come up with words in any way since he had no difficulty lying at all? You mortal bastard, really? As she found it absurd, Lee Jeong carefully said, I apologize, but is it all right to tell you this as it is? It's fine. You have to tell me as it is, so that I can tell you what happened that day at the Horyang battle. Mok Jeongun spoke as if he didn't mind. While doing so, he glanced at the wooden doll in his bosom and smirked. You should have just given me a hint. Then there would have been no need to be led like this. But could he find out what kind of relationship Chong Ryong had with the Heaven and Earth Society and what secrets she held through this?